Hey, welcome back to another video. My name is Megan and I'm a professional writer and editor and a published author. Today's video was requested by a subscriber, so thank you, Crystal, for this idea. Full disclosure, this is a great topic that I really enjoyed planning out, but I just want to be transparent. I kind of had a hard time putting some of this into words, so bear with me. Some of my explanations might be a little more lengthy, but that's the only way I could think to explain some of these things. First, I want to share a little more about the fantasy romance that I'm writing. I do have several videos on it already, so I'll drop those links below. But a few of you have commented that I actually haven't shared much of the plot itself. Like, I haven't told you what the story is about. So I'm going to start with that. I'm going to give you a very high level look at the plot, and then I'm going to pull examples from my manuscript for this video. There hasn't been any reason I haven't shared my story already. I don't mind talking about it. I love talking about it, but in these videos, I'm always trying to strike a balance between talking about things that we can all relate to and also sprinkling bits about my own personal work. You know what I mean? If you have no interest in hearing about my manuscript, I will be devastated, but you can skip to this timestamp, and at that point, I'll be back to the topic at hand. But I would recommend you stay to get a little context. Trying to quickly sum up a book is very hard, but again, high level. This story is about a woman, a human. Her name is Veda, and she lives in a castle in the mountains called Idorna. There is only one non-human creature there. It's her grandmother, who is the queen of Idorna, and she's the last of her magical race. Somebody poisons the queen and tries to kill her. Veda suspects that the territory to the east is involved because they've been having issues with that territory already related to trade. After someone tries to kill her grandma, Veda's like, I'm not waiting on anybody to address this. I'm not waiting any longer. I'm going to that territory myself to figure all of this out. Remember, I'm glossing over a ton of details to try to keep this brief. So she goes to this territory to the east, and she's going in her mind to, number one, figure out who poisoned her grandma, and number two, try to understand why this territory is messing with their trade agreement. Over the course of the second and third acts, remember, I follow the 4-act structure. She learns that the attempt on her grandmother's life is like the least of their concerns because there are villains much bigger at play. I'm going to leave it at that for now. Again, I'm trying to keep this very concise. If you flipped to this moment in the video, I am now getting back to the requested topic. I'm going to read Crystal's comments so you know what we're looking at. Crystal left these comments on my last video about creating character arcs. They said, I'm writing a new story and it is a fantasy. I want to make it a series which requires some serious character arcs. I was wondering if you have advice on writing fantasy where the human main character is taken to another world. I asked for clarification and Crystal said, for example, in this case, the protagonist is getting to know the world at the same time as the reader, so I'm not sure how to avoid info dumping about the world when even the MC, which is the main character, doesn't know much about it. How do you know what to reveal to the MC so that there's still tension without spoiling too much, yet not have everything so mysterious? I'm also not sure how to help her get used to the new world. Of course, she's super overwhelmed, so any tips on how to move on from that confused and overwhelmed state in order to get on with the story? Again, Crystal, thank you so much for leaving these. Before I dive in, I'm offering a gentle reminder to everyone watching that I'm not any type of writing or book coach, nor do I assume that my way of doing things is the only way or the best way. I'm simply going to share how I address this in my novel because I did run into this exact thing. I have a human protagonist who ends up traveling to a very magically charged environment. Before I get into Crystal's first question, I want to share what I think is most important when it comes to avoiding info dumping. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, when I say info dumping, it's this thing that authors do when they feel that there's information that the reader needs to know. So instead of like seamlessly weaving it into the story as part of the story, they just sort of like vomit all of it up in a few huge paragraphs because they're just trying to get you caught up. It's a very easy mistake to make as an author, and it's a very easy mistake to spot as a reader. So what you want to do is reveal the information in a natural way. What I learned, and this is what I think is very important, is you don't have to share all the information with the reader as you go. The MC doesn't need to have all the answers. In fact, they shouldn't. The boundary I drew was kind of like this. If I drop this kernel of information, but don't fully explain what it means, is it going to cause confusion to the reader until I finally explain the meaning behind it? Is it going to cause the book to feel disjointed? If not, then it's okay to drop that kernel and leave it for now. Here's an example. The opening scene of my book is Veda, the main character, and Siren, the main male human character in the story, and they're training in the gym in Idorna in the castle, and they're going hard, and they're using swords and bow staffs, and they're sparring like hand to hand. Siren starts to limp. He's got a slight limp on one side, and all I say in that moment is that the familiar hitch in his hip came back, and he very carefully kept a blank expression, which is what Siren always does when he's in pain. So we know he suffered some sort of injury in the past that didn't fully heal, and we know that in the moment he's hurting, but he's not going to admit that. In fact, Veda tries to say, you know, I've had enough training for today, trying to make it sound like she's the one who's tired and wants to stop, and Siren says, I don't need your pity. So then we realize that whatever happened to his leg, his hip, maybe he's embarrassed or ashamed, maybe he's scared of looking weak. His injury comes up again later in Act 1. Siren is training with the general of the human army, who he reports to, and it makes sense in the context of their conversation, but the general is getting close to retiring, and they're talking about who will take his place when he retires, and he says to Siren, well, it should have been you, but, and he looks at his leg. So we learn another detail here. This injury cost Siren what should have been his future career as general of the army. Huge blow to the ego. This injury must be worth mentioning, or I wouldn't mention it twice in the first act. But what was the injury? What happened? I don't say. Not until Act 3, when Veda is talking to who I consider to be the male protagonist. At this point, she's in that eastern territory, which again is very magically charged, and the male protagonist belongs to a magical race. Just before this scene, he was attacked and he sustained a bunch of injuries. So in the scene I'm referencing, he's healing in bed after this attack, and she visits him, Veda visits him, and says, this is the second time I wasn't able to help someone that I care about. And he's like, what are you talking about? A little later in that same conversation, we finally learn that when they were teenagers, Siren was injured, and in your leg you have something called the femoral artery. You slice open any artery, and to my knowledge, you can bleed out. So when they were very young, he was injured, he was bleeding everywhere. Veda tried to help him, even just temporarily, to stop the bleeding, and she couldn't. Her grandmother, the last of that magical race, she had to swoop in and do it. Well, who cares? Well, because Veda was born human and not magical, her mother abandoned her. She also feels responsible for ending that race because she was born human. This is part of her internal struggle because she's always felt inadequate as a result, never good enough. And not being able to save Siren, and then the male protagonist, those were two more examples of her struggle with feeling unworthy. If she did have magical abilities, maybe she could have helped them. You don't put all those pieces together until Act 3, but it doesn't stop you from moving past that first chapter where the injury is first brought up. Now, when I was writing the first chapter, something I talk about in this video, I did initially start to explain why Siren was limping, what the injury was all about, but the first chapter is very fast-paced. And when I read it back, I could tell that including the backstory slowed it down. Also, it wouldn't mean much to the reader yet, because in the first chapter, the reader doesn't really know exactly what Veda's internal struggle is. They don't know yet why that injury that Siren had 15 plus years ago is still relevant. By the time I explain it in Act 3, it's relevant. It means something. So that's the first thing I want to point out. This was a huge lesson for me. I think it's really important and addresses a lot of what Crystal is saying. You don't have to reveal everything in real time as the MC is discovering it, and not revealing certain details is often what keeps people reading. All right, so let's return to Crystal's first question. This video might be a little bit longer. How do you avoid info dumping about the new world when even the MC doesn't know much about it? I think some of this depends on what point of view you are writing from, but let's consider Act 2 of your book, Crystal. And I don't know how you structure your manuscripts, but I'm referring to Act 2 of 4, so roughly the second quarter of the book, which is typically when the MC is thrown into this new world. In your case, a human is thrown into a magical world. In Act 2, which I talk a lot about in this video, the MC is supposed to be a fish out of water. They're supposed to be kind of lost. And I say that to you to mean that you shouldn't feel pressured to explain everything as the MC experiences it and make them feel more comfortable right away, because in their reality, they don't have the answers. They're not comfortable. That's the whole point. In my Act 2, my goal was to let things unravel gradually. Not revealing everything as you go increases tension, increases conflict, which is great. Here's an example, and I promise I'll keep this one shorter than the last. When Veda, my protagonist, travels to the territory to the east, those creatures, many of whom are elves, are not happy to see her because they're all mad at the humans living in Idorna, and they're mad at the Queen of Idorna as well. Veda travels there with very little information about Idorna's relationship with this territory, and with incorrect information about the territory, which she doesn't know at first. So in her early conversations with the elves, they're bringing up details that she's unfamiliar with, and she's like, what are you guys even talking about? For instance, one elf mentions, you ignored our cries for help. Another little kernel of information that I dropped. She doesn't understand this because she doesn't yet know that the elves contacted the queen in Idorna, her grandmother, several times asking for help, and the queen ignored them. I explain this much later. Veda's a bit clueless, but I don't explain everything in that moment so that everyone knows what's going on. The truth comes to light as I progress. In fact, there are a lot of moments later in my book where I finally explain something, and I want the reader to go, oh, so that's why earlier on X, Y, and Z happened, and all the pieces come together. Now, an instance when I messed this up and didn't explain enough was when I first mentioned the various magical races on this continent and some of their issues with each other, but I provided no context beyond the names of the races. And a friend of mine was reading it, and he was kind of like, this is just like a grocery list of magical creatures. It's jarring, it's random, what's the point? So I beefed that up a little bit so that it meant something to the reader. Avoiding info dumping is actually easy. What you need to do, though, what's a little harder in my opinion, is making sure that by the end of the story, you've tied up all those loose ends. If you mention something important but don't immediately explain it, which is okay, make sure you do explain it at some point when it feels natural and valuable. Crystal also asked, I'm also not sure how to help her get used to the new world. Of course, she's super overwhelmed. So any tips on how to move on from that confused and overwhelmed state in order to get on with the story? Again, I encourage you to go watch this video about Act 2 of 4, but let's kind of recap it here. In the beginning of Act 2, your MC is thrown into this new world. If you're not writing fantasy or you don't have a protagonist that goes to a new territory, a new geographic area, then in your case, your protagonist might be thrown into new circumstances. They don't have to physically go anywhere. All the same stuff will apply. By the end of Act 2 of 4, which is roughly the middle of the book, there should be another big plot point, some sort of turning point. That's just part of the story arc. That's what happens in the middle of the book. What I recommend, and this helped me tremendously, is look at Act 2 in isolation and ask yourself, where does the MC start and where do I need her to end? Again, only in reference to Act 2. Really build this out. In the beginning of Act 2, how does she think? How does she feel? What does she believe? What are her relationships with the other characters? And then answer all those same questions for the end of Act 2. Knowing where your MC has to start and end is going to make it so much easier to kind of fill in the blanks. Let's do another example. I know that in the beginning of Act 2, when Veda first arrives in this Eastern territory, she thinks she's going to fix everything through brute force, through sheer will alone. She's a little full of herself because back in Idorna, she's kind of a big fish in a small pond. But in this new territory, she's no one. And she's a human surrounded by magic. And she's ill-equipped. Doesn't have the information she needs. and she has chronic health problems, and she doesn't like the creatures who live in this territory. She thinks they're behind her grandmother's attempted assassination. They don't like her either. By the end of Act 2 in my manuscript, again, this is the midpoint of the book, Veda has started to really warm up to these various creatures. They're starting to warm up to her. She's learned more about what's really happening and is starting to understand that her people aren't completely innocent, and the elves in this territory aren't necessarily the bad guys. That gives you an idea of the transformation that needs to occur in Act 2. But how? Well, if she and the other characters need to go from hating each other to liking each other, or at least accepting each other, then I need opportunities for them to see each other doing nice things for others. For example, there's an incident in the book in Act 2 where a huge flock of sheep is killed, and it's very gruesome. Veda steps onto this field, this pasture, where like hundreds of dead sheep have been ripped open, and she's wading through like blood and guts to help the farmer, who's a gnome, load the bodies onto a cart. He's trying to clean up the mess. She was one of 2 beings who stepped up to help. The male protagonist sees this, and he doesn't reveal it in that moment, but we find out later that when he saw her do that very selfless act, he saw her in a different light. A human, a female no less, didn't even hesitate to step up and help with a very gross situation. Considering a human exploring a magical world, other details you'll want to cover are: how do they respond to the magic? How do they react and learn to live with it? What settings do they need to explore? Who do they need to meet? In my book, Veda discovers that being around so much magic actually has a negative physiological effect on her. So she has to expose herself to it in small quantities, like lower level magic, to allow herself to slowly adjust to it. All this said, let's go back to the question: how do you make the MC feel less overwhelmed? That does not occur in one moment. You don't want them to feel less overwhelmed too quickly, because in Act 2, they're trying to find their way, and that takes time. And they're trying to find their way in the wrong way. Let them be confused and overwhelmed. Consider where you need them to be at the end of Act 2 and gradually work your way there. If we kind of take a step back and look at this whole conversation like from a bird's eye view, I think something else that at least helped me personally, how do I explain this? I tried to, again, drop those kernels of information and make sure that I answered everything in one fell swoop as I was writing. Okay, and maybe this works for some authors, but then what I found is that making sure I revealed all of the necessary information at the right pace, at the right times, that was a little overwhelming, and it kind of slowed me down creatively when I just needed to be writing. So one thing that I'm doing, and again, this is just what's been working for me, I'm in the home stretch of writing this first draft, and I already know there are bits of information that I introduced and purposely withheld so that I wasn't info dumping, and I made a note of it. I'm gonna have to come back to this. I need to come back to this to make sure I tie up these loose ends. What I'm actually doing in some cases is I'm planning to finish the manuscript, and then I'm gonna go back and kind of weave in that information and like smaller subplots and those details. And the way I'm looking at it is kind of writing the story in layers. The first layer is my first draft, and that's the bulk of the work. That's gonna be like 90% of this, I say, will be written cohesively as a story from start to finish. But then there's all these other little details that I wanna stack on top of it. Think of it like, in fact, I think in Story Genius, it's one of the books I recommended in a previous video. I think it's in that book, she talks about it like building a house. You don't start at ground level and build the framework and the plumbing and the electric all the way to the top. You don't do that. You dig the hole. I don't know what goes into building a house. But let's say you dig the hole for the house, you lay the slab, and then you do the framework. That's one layer. And then you do the electric. That's another layer. And then you do the plumbing. That's another layer. So you're not doing everything from start to finish. You're doing one thing from start to finish, and then you're doing another thing from start to finish. I don't know if I'm making any sense. It makes perfect sense in my head. Hopefully you get what I'm saying. The point is, it's okay if you don't again, tie up all these loose ends in the first go. No manuscript is done after you finish the first draft. At least it shouldn't be done then. There's still edits and revisions and layering on these little threads of information that you are slowly unraveling so that you avoid info dumping. And again, I just have a running list in the notes on my computer. And anytime I first mention something and don't explain it in its entirety, I leave a note. I've just got a bullet point list. And a lot of the time I actually have that list open as I'm writing so that it's in my, my peripherals, because as I'm writing, sometimes I'll glance at it and I'll be like, oh, that's a good time to bring up this thing again. And that way you don't forget. This was a tricky one. These questions, they're hard to talk about because like in my head, I have an idea of what I mean, but putting it into words is tricky. To sum it up, look at it like this. If you feel yourself starting to info dump, stop and ask yourself, if I withhold some of this information until later, can they continue reading without being lost? If yes, save some of it for later. You will come to a place in your book where you're going to go, this is where I'm going to explain that thing I mentioned, and it'll make perfect sense and it will feel natural. I hope this helped at least a tiny bit. Thank you again, Crystal, for your comment and asking such great, valuable questions that I know a lot of us can relate to. If I didn't answer them, please feel free to comment again with feedback. I'm always happy to take another stab at this and record a follow-up video. And again, if you don't write fantasy, all the same stuff still applies to you. Act 2 takes the protagonist and it puts them either in a new world or in new circumstances, or both. So any way you cut it, info dumping is something we all potentially encounter and need to avoid. I think that will do it for today. I love you dearly. I'm proud of you. You're doing great. You are a great writer. And yeah, drop me a comment and say hello. Bye.